So we've looked at principles of balance and emphasis in order to create unity. Let's look at a couple others that are related as well as we continue on in thinking about principles of design. Okay, the first one we'll look at today is rhythm. And when we think about rhythm, it's related to the word repetition and it's related to the word pattern as well. And what we get from that is often the idea of movement, right? So what we can do is we can emphasize something, show progression at something, and get the viewer to move through one part of the composition to the next. And as we think about direct meaning, and we think about harmony, we think about elements that show this movement from one place to the next. And what we might think of to begin with is even just audible, something we think about in music. We have this repetition of a sound. Well, what we're doing in terms of visually, we're doing something that creates this repetition of the elements: line, shape, color, texture, value, etc. So how can we use rhythm as a design tool? And we might think about the idea of harmony. Everything kind of belongs together then. So we'll look at some examples as we talk about this. But how do we use pattern and elements to create up this repetition? So here's a quick photograph to look at. And if you think about what you see here in terms of what's repeated, well, I'll give you a moment, but just a quick few seconds there. You can always pause it. But if you think about the idea of, well, there's roads that are repeated that create a rhythm. There are trees, there are houses, there are buildings, and there are cars actually as well. So I want you to look at this parking lot in the center. Doesn't have any cars like the one on the right, but there is repetition of those parking lots as a whole, but this one's different. And one other thing that's different, just to kind of dig a little deeper, is look at the difference from the very top of this parking lot to the very bottom. And what we actually get is a gradient, just kind of fascinating to me. This was taken in the late 60s. And why would there be a gradient? Well, if you look at where the parking spots are, simply has to do with volume and things recorded in, or cars parking in the same spots all the time. So just kind of you see this gradient simply just by oil dropping from a car over many volumes or numbers of cars. Just something kind of interesting to see. But if you think about that, rhythm kind of as well makes it work. Okay. So if you think about establishing rhythm, we're using the principles of design. We're using color, texture, we're using positive and negative, or figure and ground, but we're also using the principal ideas of emphasis and balance. And how do we create this rhythm? Something to pay attention to. And a lot of it has to do with repetition, and a lot of it has to do with some variation as well. So here we have some feet, both going up and down. We have this idea of just a simple circle that's scaled differently, that's rotated differently, that's colored differently. Or here we have a lot of this, again, all three of these have a lot of similar elements in them. So this one on the right has just a bunch of runners preparing for the Olympics in 1964, but there are differences. Not everyone is exact, right? The hair might be different, the body position might be different, the speed might be different, the color of the shoes, the color of the skin, the color of the hair, etc. I mean, there's all kinds of different color variations there to show variety as well. So it's just kind of interesting to think about something like that uses rhythm. It repeats to create that movement. So what we can use as designers are we can use something similar that connects everything together: shape, color, etc., pattern, texture. But how can we do that with some variety? Change scale, change color, change actual shape. We get this thinking about something, the idea of progression, and getting the reader to understand the hierarchy of what they need to understand. So as we create this, we're thinking about, well, what do we want them to see first, and how can we do that? And then how can we link it to what they should see second and third and fourth, etc. And some of it has to do with placement, some of it has to do with guiding the viewer through. But how can we create this rhythm and vary it up a little bit? Again, everything doesn't need to be exactly the same. We can use it to grab attention. We can use it to guide the viewer and lead them from one part to another. And this has been used in magazines, been used in art, paintings, and things like that over time. We've seen some of these before, but this idea of this rhythm, these curves, these circles, these lines of text that are rotated, and the use of placement and spacing, the use of color and scale can help create this rhythm. We might actually even hear some things and connect our mind in that way as you think about it. So it was used in poster design, it was used in advertising design, but a simple repetition of shapes with a little bit of variety. And depending on how things are organized, things can be more easily read. There's a bunch of floating squares that look like they have text on them. And once we put those together, we actually get a word, right? And then you guide the viewer through, and you see below the name of the company, you see some other text that kind of tells you what they do. Again, it's the simple repetition with a little variety of, here we have the logo, we have the title of where they get energy or electricity, we have the actual light bulb that's repeated, and the space in all of those elements, and the variety of those, of the word, of the image, of the logo, all give us some of that rhythm. Okay, so we'll use that. How can you create some interest? Maybe there's some components of your design that you're working on that can help you create this rhythm, this movement, this pattern, to help guide the viewer, help gather their interest too. Look at another one here just quickly, because our next project we're going to work on scale and proportion a little bit more. And so we'll talk about it. It's just the size of an element in relation to something else within that. And you think about how we see something first versus second versus third, but you think about the size of it specifically in the idea of scale and proportion. What this can do is give us a different sense of what we're seeing. It can give us some variety. It can give us some hierarchy. And how does that come together for the whole as we look? Like I said, we're going to come back and use this one more in depth as we work on our next project. So don't worry about it too much yet. I just wanted to remind you of what scale and proportion are. And proportion is just the relative size relationships between elements as well. Right? So we can have everything the same size, or we can have everything larger, we can have everything smaller, we can have everything mixing it up as well, but then again guiding the viewer through to see what we want them to see first and second, but the relationship of one element to the rest or to the next. Okay, so our last one that we're going to look at here is because it's related to rhythm and the sense of, or the illusion of, movement or motion. How can we create that as designers? Okay, most of what we are doing in this class is related to 2D. Now, even if we got into 3D, we're still not getting a lot of motion, but how do we create that illusion of it to help make some interest for the viewer? Okay, so if you look at this image on the right, how do we get this sense of movement? How do we get this sense of motion? Well, it might be because of the angle of of the lines along the top. It might be because of again, the spacing between some of the clouds, or the plane, one plane versus another, versus the clouds. That spacing makes a difference as well, but it feels like it's moving, and partly because it's not perfectly horizontal. This has often been captured in just static, pure photography. We get a sense of blurriness, and using that to help create motion. There's a whole series of these that were done quite a ways back, about how we actually create this illusion. But we have the blurriness of sides, we have the connection of the horizontal line that creates this motion as well. We can use, and I won't leave this one up too long, but we can use this idea of curved lines to create motion as well, or movement. And if you just stare at this, you start to see waves kind of appearing, and some of it has to do with the sharpness of the curves, the steepness of the curves, creating that as well. But how we use angles can help with the idea of movement, right? So it's this layering of things on the left, of this angled bridge and this angled boat and this angled set of people walking, and yet we also have this rain or this weather coming down at an angle, and everything is kind of slightly off. So layering can help create movement. Overlapping of things can help with that. We have this rotation of things, and the rotation doesn't need to be sharp or really, really steep. What you see on the right of this dancer is somebody who has really sharp angles, and that shows a lot more movement and action than the one on the left, but both of them still carry that idea. We can repeat figures to help create this. So if you're in the multimedia program, you're doing and planning and showcasing frame 1 versus frame 2 versus whatever, frame 4, right? So you're showing those as you move along, but we have this movement of one place to another to another. So repeating a figure and even changing and adding some variety can help create that idea of movement. And this was done many centuries ago in books. And part of the fact was that much of the culture at that time, the quantity of people couldn't read. So what they did was tell the same story using just imagery. And so it's using that idea to create and tell this story with some variety in it. So again, playing what I think is fascinating about these is playing with the use of space then as well. So there's a lot going on, especially on this example on the right, but then we have this figure who's hanging off in the edges a little bit more. But it's this idea of using movement and motion that way by just repeating and showing things step by step. Comics are common with these as well. And what's interesting is there's a lot of repetition of the actual figure of Calvin in these. But what you also notice within that then is placement. So we don't see the full-on body head to toe. We see in the use of corners and the use of diagonal lines as well to create that motion. We can use cropping along with that to show motion. So here's Jimmy Connors, the tennis player. We don't see every piece of him or his tennis racket, but we see this, it's been cropped. We see more motion that way. So maybe you can use that component. Again, same thing here with Jordan. We see that in photography. We don't need to see. We see a lot more motion because of angles. We see a lot more motion because not the entire figure is shown. We can even add a little blurriness around components. And that allows us to focus on something else, but we use blur to help with that. My father-in-law is kind of known for taking and dancing We haven't recorded this, but he takes and does these on the beach and runs around and shows motion. Or you've probably seen these same in photography or tried to take them yourself as you capture motion with something that's not in the photo, it's not actually moving at all. We used fast shapes or curved lines can help create motion. So it looks like this dog is jumping out of the logo. Multiple image with repetition and a little more variety can help create these with curves. Again, the knees go up, 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 and then down, down, down. We kind of create that same idea, but using one or more than one image can help with that. Lines of force would be something along the lines of diagonals. So we can use those or sharp curves or big curves to create this idea of more of a story happening just by looking at it. You know, what's going to happen next? There's a variety of repetition as well in terms of kind of shows you those and just lets you look at those a little bit more, whether or not motion is something that relaxes you or gives you more movement than you want. It's okay. Grouping things related to that can help create motion or movement, even though they're all faces, but each face is different. Some are even at a different angle. It gives you more variety. And what's fascinating, you do play with the optical idea as well. And if you just look and stare at this composition on the left, all of a sudden some start to turn gray, some start to turn black, some stay white, but even they get this movement, just calming. And what I think is good for this and the variety within it is because of what it's for. This is for the jazz. It kind of feels the same if you think about it. There's a little bit of variety there. So think about how you can use these components to make a little motion. You're using rhythm. You can play with scale as you work on them, but you're using rhythm to help create this idea of motion and bring everything together with unity. So consider those as you actually move on to the next part of your project.